Welcome everyone to our session today. We are delighted to have, as part of the GCSJ seminar series, um, in effect, looking at decolonization as a contested practice, evidence from the Open University. We have, in fact, three speakers today, with our main speaker being Shannon Martin, PhD student who's completed her PhD at the Open University. But our opening remarks for the day will be offered by Professor Alan Lavelle, who is OU's Pro-Vice Chancellor of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. And we will be closing following Shannon's talk. We will have Darren Gray as the respondent, who's the Senior Manager for Access, Participation and Success PVC students. And so we have a really packed session today with, in fact, the three speakers around it. And following the three speakers, we will also have some time, about 10-15 minutes for a Q&A. So in the meantime, if you have any questions or comments, please do put those in the chat, and then we'll follow up with those questions at the end of once the three speakers have discussed and spoken. Just a reminder that the session is being recorded. If you have any questions or concerns, things like that, please do get in touch with us. I'd be grateful if everyone could make sure that the mics are muted and the cameras are off, because, as I said, the session will be recorded. So without any further delay, I would like to invite Alan for the opening remarks for the session today. Please, Alan.
Thank you very much, Gunjan, and thank you very much for inviting me for the opening remarks. And I was reflecting on a few different ways to provide opening remarks, and I thought that if I focus on the session overview for today, but also then to provide my own comments and reflections on that and within that in regards to decolonisation, and to bring in some of the examples of the work that I've been involved in this space over the last 4 or 5 years, before passing on to Dr. Shannon Martin for the core talk today. So really just to set the scene and think about the background around commitments across HE to advance and improve racial equity. But we know that, and are aware of from colleagues and students sharing lived experiences, that racism and racial inequality continue to shape how higher education is experienced by racially minoritized students and colleagues, particularly those from Black backgrounds. And across the sector, decolonisation has become increasingly more visible, and some attribute this to gaining renewed attention, which I'd agree with, following the murder of George Floyd in 2020 and the global reckoning with structural racism that followed. I'd also like to highlight here as well from my own work and readings, where we cannot forget the voices also of those from the Students' Union and initiatives such as Why is My Curriculum White, as well as Black and racialised academics and professional staff within UK higher education who have long worked in this space, often facing significant resistance and hostile environments within higher education institutions. We move on then to look at decolonisation and how decolonisation is considered across higher education, and focusing on the talk today around decolonisation as a contested practice, and we'll be moving on to looking at evidence from the OU. I wanted to bring in some evidence from the spaces that I've been in previously. And decolonisation is indeed still and remains to be a deeply contested concept. And piecing apart the meaning of decolonisation and what does decolonisation mean to each of us as colleagues, as students, as individuals, and that varying significantly across the sector. And in Shannon's overview, there's usefully 2 really key questions that are put to us. So firstly, what does decolonisation actually mean in higher education? And secondly, what does it look like in practice? So I wanted to take those 2 questions forward and provide some examples of spaces that I've navigated in relation to decolonisation previously. So thinking back to 2020, I remember exploring approaches from a number of higher education institutions, and some of which claimed that they had published and made efforts to fully embed decolonisation across the university and the curriculum within a matter of months, which is surprising, to say the least. And when you look at those approaches, excuse me, they're very tick box in nature, 1 to 2 pages of this is how you decolonise curricula, and limited in essence. So going back to 2020, when I was working at the University of Reading at the time as I was Associate PVC for Diversity and Inclusion, a key focus and related to the key question that's been put to, the first key question that's been put to us, what does decolonisation actually mean? Over 4 years at Reading, it was really key to establish what does decolonisation mean to our students and also to our colleagues. And indeed, there may be overlap, but also differences too. So to establish that, we're engaged in listening exercises over 4 months, and we heard from colleagues and students with lived experiences, from allies and those who had grown up in previously colonised nations. And this listening enabled us to start this work by creating an institutional vision for decolonisation. In the published resources, there's about a page or so, one from students and another page from colleagues, about what decolonisation means to them. Of course, I don't have time to go through all of that today, but what I wanted to do is draw out the key points from each of those narratives, and thinking about parallels that we might see. Excuse me. Just getting over an illness, you can probably tell. Parallels that we might see in the talk today. So for students, the key points that emerged were being seen and in the curriculum, being represented in the curriculum, explicit consideration within written materials and discussions and debates, there's consideration of different perspectives, and also evidence that decolonisation had been threaded through an entire programme and not a tokenistic slide in a lecture, for example. And I remember the student voice really strongly here when they said to me, we're not going to be fooled by just a brief mention of decolonisation in a slide, in a way, particular lecture. We need to see this throughout all of our learning, through our assessments, through a module and through a programme. So for colleagues, then there were a number of key points as well that emerged, and very much thinking about, in line with systemic change, is the need for this work to be institutional wide, which I fully support, and it'll be useful when we're listening to Shannon later, excuse me, in her talk about the key points for us to consider as an institution here at the OU in regards to decolonisation. But from the work I was involved in previously from colleagues, there were 5 key points that emerged. That we need to have a better understanding of the historical as well as the ongoing impact of colonialism on our disciplines, and looking at origin stories as well. Interrogating Eurocentrism in knowledge production, including throughout our teaching and assessment methods. Resisting essentialism, so looking at the belief that all individuals of the same ethnic or cultural group share similar traits, and looking at individual approaches and considerations and lived experiences. Focusing on, therefore, on individual positionality by analysing, considering our own social identities, our own positionality, therefore, and locating oneself within a societal matrix of power. And lastly, acknowledging, critiquing, and changing the influence of systemic racism throughout all power structures within the university. So the next question, therefore, once we've established an institutional vision, and rightly so, is, well, what does this look like in practice? And through talks that I've done both at Reading and nationally, internationally in this space, often colleagues have experienced the greatest level of resistance for sure, and in some institutions it presents itself as more extreme resistance than in others. But what's driving this resistance, a factor could be, is a lack of awareness of what decolonisation actually means, and a misinterpretation and misconceptualisation of that, therefore, both conceptually within the classroom. So we had heard from colleagues who are motivated to engage in decolonisation, but what does it look like, and what support would we need to provide? So we co-created a set of resources with students, with colleagues, and with the Students' Union, which are open access on the Reading website. There's two quite extensive documents of about 40, 50 pages each. And seeing as we all learn in different ways and process information in different ways, the tools and techniques within those documents also varied. So they included reflective questions, case studies for what does good actually look like, student authored question and answers, like, I'm too busy to do this, what's the purpose of this, and a response from a student. Will I disadvantage white students who engage in decolonisation? And a really powerful responses from a number of students, some of which referred to systemic racism. And also looking at an annotated bibliography, particularly when white allies had gone out to read resources, watch a documentary or another knowledge source to develop their own knowledge of decolonisation and reflecting on what they learned and how that had impacted their teaching practice, and good examples from students in the classroom already. And although correlations are tricky, excuse me, we did see a sizable reduction in the ethnicity awarding gap, and a big contributory factor of that was the institutional buy-in. But also, why did we see change? And from feedback is how authentic the resources were, and that they mirrored the lived experiences of many students and colleagues who contributed their time to this project. And I'm really grateful to everyone who supported us in that important piece of work. And I just want to do a little shout out really to the group that worked in this space. And we received the Vance HE Collaborative Award for Teaching Excellence last year, and there's only 17 teams nationally to receive that. And I say that I'm proud of this achievement, not because that I got recognised, but the recognition of all those people and many colleagues and students with lived experience that deserve that recognition of their excellence. So in summary, therefore, I'd say that decolonisation is not an overnight tick box. It's a process that requires continual reflection, institutional support at multiple levels, and the fostering of a culture that embraces positive change. So to move on then to Dr. Shannon's talk. This presentation draws on doctoral research conducted at the Open University and explores how decolonisation and anti-racism are understood, interpreted and enacted by those who work and study within the institution. Through the voices of students and staff, it examines how lived experience, racial identity and institutional power shape what decolonisation means. The findings in today's talk show that decolonisation is not a neutral or shared concept, even within the OU. Instead, it is contrastly understood, differently supported, and shaped by institutional hierarchies. While many individuals approach decolonial work with genuine commitment, the research highlights how coloniality continues to operate within the westernised university through everyday practices of power, control, and decision-making. And the talk ends by posing a really important question, whether decolonisation can move beyond rhetoric within the existing university structures and what kind of changes this would require. So over to you, Shannon.
Thank you, Alan. Shannon, if you'd like to share your presentation, that would be great.
Is that all good?
Yes, great.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. So hello everyone, and thank you for coming today. So I'm Dr. Shannon Martin. It's the first time I've used that in a presentation, and I studied at the Open University, so I finished my PhD back in December 2025, so not that long ago. And my kind of research interest, I've been involved in a variety of different projects that have looked at social inequalities in education. And today, though, I'll be discussing the different ways that decolonisation is understood based on research that I've conducted based on my doctoral project, so on research and evidence that's collected from the Open University. So just to give a kind of brief background, I'll be discussing some background information in relation to decolonisation and higher education and my research questions that I utilised, and then I'll outline my research approach and then discuss some of the key findings and how to move forward at the OU. So decolonisation, what is it? the term essentially became popularized or became more prominent within kind of the lexicon during, well, post 2020, so during the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. And during this time, it was kind of brought to the attention that racial inequalities and structural issues that have existed within institutions and within society since its conception were still dominating despite the kind of equality legislation and actions that had taken place to address it. And this became more prominent during the Black Lives Matter movement after the murder of George Floyd, as Alan mentioned. And this, it's important to remember that decolonisation was not a key approach that was kind of introduced just during this period of 2020. It existed long before this, and in UK higher education institutions, it actually was being researched by academics and being posed as an approach to address racial inequalities. It was just because of the kind of prominence of the time that it gained more recognition as being an approach to address these issues. And the prominence of decolonisation during this time actually led to an increased amount of opportunities. So we saw an increase in funding for decolonial and anti-racist work and new opportunities for all students and staff members, but specifically for ethnic minority students and staff members. And I would say I was one of the people who benefited from the kind of advocacy of decolonisation during that time, as I was given, this funded PhD to conduct this work. And I'm sure that when people have looked at or come across kind of information regarding decolonisation within higher education institutions, and there have been a variety of different kind of means by which to investigate this. But one of the ways that has been most common, I think, that people would have come into contact with is kind of decolonising the curriculum content through decolonising the curriculum, inclusive curriculums, and anti-racist curriculums. So there kind of has been a focus in relation to the kind of knowledge production process and in relation to the curriculum material that's being produced. However, it's interesting when we look at how decolonisation is applied to higher education institutions, because decolonisation has no universally agreed upon definition. So the term itself is actually contested, and it comes so essentially there's a different ways that people understand decolonisation. So you can have two different higher education institutions that view decolonisation in a completely different way, or you can have people within the same institution who are conceptualising decolonisation in a different way, but everyone's kind of using the same word essentially to define what they're meaning. And just to kind of represent this, I just wanted to delve into some of the information on the different kind of theories and origins of decolonisation. So it emerges as a perspective that comes from the Global South, and there's a variety of different perspectives within the Global South. So we can see here, I've outlined some of them, and then some of the origins of where these theories come from. So for example, decolonial theory, which is the perspective that I adopted predominantly within my research conducting this thesis, although I drew on a variety of different kind of areas. I adopted decolonial theory, which is from a Latin American perspective, because I kind of liked the idea of coloniality, of this kind of long-standing patterns of power that continue to determine how social processes and knowledge production is formulated. And I thought that that was a good lens through which to kind of look at decolonisation within higher education. And you'll find that there's a lot of similar themes that run through decolonial kind of theories from my perspective and from what I've read. So there's kind of Eurocentrism, this discussion of tackling knowledge production and advocating for kind of decolonising the mind and so on and so forth. However, it's important to kind of differentiate between what theory or perspective one is engaging with, because there are different perspectives that exist within them. So for example, the School of Autonomous Thought kind of focuses, which is based in Singapore, focuses on the element of academic decolonisation. Whereas if we look at like a key post-colonial theorist such as Frantz Fanon, he advocates for decolonisation being a violent phenomenon and looks at it in relation to kind of the destruction of the current system. So when we're using the word decolonisation, I just wanted to kind of utilise or show the different perspectives in order to show just how different they can be. And then also to say that when we're looking at this idea of decolonization, it's important that we kind of engage with these theoretical perspectives that have existed for an extremely long time. Otherwise, we kind of pose the problematic kind of notion of colonizing decolonization by not engaging with the actual theoretical perspectives of people who are from the global south. So based on all of this led me to conduct my research, which investigates the Open University, and it's specifically concerning how decolonization is understood as a key approach to address issues of racism and racial inequality at the OU. So here I have some of my supplementary research questions. So I essentially was aiming to look into how decolonization is understood, what the different understandings are, and then also how this work is developed and disseminated at the Open University specifically, and what staff members who are involved in work relating to anti-racism and decolonization, how they perceive the effectiveness of this work to be. And the Open University is an extremely interesting example because it's a distance learning higher education institution in the UK, and it has a predominantly white student and staff population. So my data from my thesis shows that 82% of staff members identify as white. And it also has this social justice ethos of being open to all people, places, methods, and ideas. And so when we delve into this idea of decolonization and how it's understood at the OU, it's an interesting area to kind of look into. So just to go over how I conducted my research, so I adopted elements of participatory action research through co-producing recommendations with students and staff. And during the focus groups and interviews that I conducted with students and staff, I adopted methodologies such as a fishbone diagram. So that kind of involves presenting a skeleton framework of a fish on a board and then having the problem area at the top, which in this case was racism in higher education, and then having the students and staff members kind of discuss the possible effects and causes of why racism exists within higher education. And I thought that this would be a good way to kind of introduce students into and staff members, sorry, into a discussion surrounding the issues that are present. And then I also implemented photo elicitation. So on the screen, you can see that there is an image of different people, and these people are vice chancellors who were in positions from an ethnic minority background back when I conducted my research. And the reason why I presented this image, it took place after I had asked students and staff members how they understood decolonization directly. And I thought that this particular method would be useful because it would allow people to be able to kind of activate a different part of their brains, a different part of their explaining kind of process in relation to the sensitive topic of decolonization. Because the image kind of delves into whether people understand decolonization as kind of this ethnic minority representation, or whether they view it as something that's to do with kind of institutional and structural change as well. So I really wanted to delve into those kind of insights. And just to say, the focus groups that I conducted, I separated students and staff members, and then I also separated the focus groups racially, and this was to kind of safeguard individuals in relation to possibilities for racial trauma to occur. And I know that this can't be completely eradicated, and also that there are kind of intersecting identities that exist that also could play a role in potential harm, and also that ethnic minority groups are not a homogenous group, but this was just my approach in order to be able to kind of tackle that best way that I believed I could. And then I also conducted individual interviews with students and staff members who were not able to participate in the focus groups. And I thought that this was an important element because it would allow students and staff members who might not be available during those times to still have a voice. And also, I then conducted individual interviews with staff members who were working directly on issues relating to anti-racism and decolonization. And I also examined policies and initiatives that were openly available at the OU. So to delve into some of the findings, so decolonization essentially fell into being understood as two kind of camps. So it was either institutional transformation or a curriculum related endeavor. And these perspectives were not set in stone. So sometimes people overlapped into viewing it in both ways, or sometimes people viewed it just one way or another way. However, it was interesting because initially when I approached the kind of conversation of asking people their conceptualizations of decolonization, many people kind of automatically went over to either the kind of colonialism and discussing the history of that, or within that, the curriculum, which I thought was extremely interesting. And I also found that people's race and job positioning impacted their perception of what decolonisation was. So, for example, there were insights that were shared from a staff member whose perspective is shared on screen. And this staff member, Lincoln, was a non-academic related staff member, and he discussed the idea that he viewed decolonisation as being kind of an academic related endeavour that was separate from his everyday responsibilities. Whereas in the same breath, I had academic staff related members who were confused by decolonisation and found difficulty in thinking of how to apply decolonisation to subjects that were specifically based outside of the social sciences. So if these subjects contain, for example, strict processes, so for example, in nursing, there are requirements that need to be met in order to be accredited by formal bodies, then there were conversations surrounding the difficulty in applying this. So what we had was a situation where people from non-academic related roles were thinking that the decolonisation was not something that they needed to engage with or wasn't a part of their everyday responsibilities. And then we also had people in academic related roles who were thinking about the idea of how to apply this and that it might not be relevant to their particular area of research, or sorry, of kind of teaching. And also, my findings indicated that one's race can play a role in how they conceptualize decolonisation. So, what I found was that students and staff members who were from an ethnic minority background were more likely to view decolonisation as more than curriculum change. So, these understandings often revolved around decolonisation being a process of institutional change, structural change, social change, and also mentioned addressing material inequalities. Whereas what I found was that students who were from a white background, sorry, students and staff members who were from a white background were more likely to view decolonisation as a curriculum related endeavour. And this included kind of, in regard to the curriculum, looking at either viewing the curriculum and adding in kind of perspectives from ethnic minority kind of thinkers and researchers, for example, or on the other hand, there was the perspective of people who viewed decolonisation in regard to the curriculum as adding in perspectives, sorry, from people from diverse backgrounds, so from post-colonial territories, etc. And it's important to remember that I'm not suggesting in this that people who are from one racial group or another view decolonisation in one way or the other 100%. It's just to say that in my research, the findings showed that if one was from a particular racial group, they may view decolonisation in a specific way. But it's important to remember that there are intersectional identities within that, and also that racial groups are, and perspectives from racial groups are not homogenous. And another key area to consider is that decolonisation might not actually be wanted or viewed as necessary by students and staff members. So interestingly, I take the examples from two students who were the only people within my kind of whole study to discuss the idea of decolonisation not being necessary or possible. So one ethnic minority student discussed the idea that decolonisation was not possible because from their perception, the university is a violent space, and so it cannot be enacted, within this space. And I've put Swadi's quote down there where she discusses this. And so from this perspective, she viewed this as not being possible because of the university's connection to colonial history and the continuation of inequality structurally. Whereas when we look at the white student who discussed decolonisation as not necessary, it was because they viewed the idea of equality legislation existing, which actually prevents racism from being a factor within higher education institutions and within society. And so to them, this approach of decolonising was not necessary because there was legislation that existed to tackle this. And then also they viewed other identities outside of their own personal characteristics, outside of their racial characteristics as being a more determining factor in their own personal journey. So for example, the loss of a family member was mentioned as being more impactful than their race has ever been. And this is interesting because it kind of shows the differences in thinking in regard to the ways that individuals kind of move through the world and then the impact that that has on their conceptualizations of decolonisation. So from the ethnic minority students' perspective, it could have been that their kind of interpretation and experiences with the world based on their race led them to this perception. Whereas for the white student, they had a lack of understanding of how race might be impactful. And it's of note to say that during the focus groups, the student who was involved, who viewed decolonisation as not being a necessary endeavour because of the equality legislation existing, actually did engage in useful discussions, and throughout the kind of conversation with other students did kind of change their opinion slightly. So yeah. So in relation to senior management, I found that there was a influence on how the senior management kind of play a role in influencing how decolonisation is perceived. So some staff members seemed aware of the role of senior management in defining and setting the parameters of how decolonisation is permitted to be conceptualised institutionally. So this is demonstrated by Morgan's example that's below, where she discusses the idea that she was aware of these kind of power dynamics in play in relation to being able to gain funding to pursue research. And she uses the kind of, well, she uses the term of kind of toning down or tuning down in order to get resource allocation. And furthermore, there was a consensus among staff that networking was extremely necessary in order to have one's voice heard and to have the opportunity to be able to conduct the work. And some staff members discussed how access to these spaces to have the opportunity to actually conduct the work were limited, which actually resulted in feelings of exclusion from not being able to participate in the work. And what I found extremely interesting in this part is that the perspectives that were shared in relation to this were often from ethnic minority women. And staff members also highlighted how they sometimes were required to undertake kind of anti-racist and work in an unpaid and unrecognised way. And interestingly, though, even the people who had connections and were able to conduct this work, they discussed the kind of journey that they had in relation to being able to conduct the work as positive. So they were able to gain funding for research and they were able to gain support from their senior management to be able to have time to conduct the work. However, people often discussed the barriers that existed in relation to the implementation of the recommendations from their work when they asked for structural change, or they hinted towards kind of having to enact structural change within the institution. And I argue that that indicates that a bottom-down approach exists where senior management perspectives kind of dominate into what is permitted and how the findings are permitted to be implemented. And I think overall this kind of limits the ideas and creativity that exist outside of dominant perspective. And so it's important to consider that. So moving on to some recommendations. So I have created a formal list of recommendations that have been based on the perspectives and recommendations shared by students and staff members, and they're available on my thesis in the conclusion chapter. And I've outlined and kind of gathered together some of them in order to discuss them here today. So based on these findings, here are some of the key institutional changes that I would suggest. So my research identified confusion and misunderstandings on the meaning of decolonisation, and also outlined how decolonisation is understood differently across the institution. Therefore, to address this, I believe that there should be a kind of, well, not I believe, I think that there should be a kind of institution-wide definition of decolonisation that should take place along justification of what decolonisation is and what decolonial perspective has been engaged with in order to kind of come up with this conceptualisation of decolonisation that is made publicly available, and that there's also justification as to why. And I think that this would help to ensure clarity on the OU's position and would help to avoid in relation to this notion of co-opting or colonising decolonisation by not engaging with work from the Global South. Furthermore, students and staff members suggested that a decolonial and anti-racist glossary should be created, as this would help to provide individuals with the language to be able to actually engage in conversation surrounding decolonisation and also anti-racism. And I would suggest that there is a building, there is training that is built that is interactive and goes beyond the kind of basic training modules in order to be able to engage people in a process of learning that goes outside of the traditional kind of tick box exercise that we see with training available. So the research findings identified issues in relation to workload allocation and also the unrecognised and unpaid labour of ethnic minority staff members. So in order to address this side, careful consideration should be paid to workload allocation by ensuring that the work undertaken is given the time to do so, and also to ensure that it's recognised formally and remunerated. And this could take place by implementing time into existing workloads that undertake this work, and which is already happening to a certain extent, but this could be conducted further, especially for people who do not have these kind of networks to be able to participate in the work. This would solidify the importance of the work within the institution, and also I would advocate, well, based on my recommendations from students and staff, that formal roles should be created to establish legitimacy and to provide a focused role on decolonisation and anti-racist work. Formal roles could include roles such as an anti-racist or decolonial lead, as this would kind of advocate for formal recognition and financial remuneration. So my research identified a top-down approach and lack of implementation when research findings are presented that challenge the existing structure. So to address this kind of top-down approach, there should be a requirement for senior management alignment. It's important that senior management actually buy into and prioritise anti-racist and decolonial work, and are seen to be doing so actively in relation to communications and meeting agendas, as this helps to establish legitimacy in relation to anti-racist and decolonial work for existing staff members. And this can take place through embedding it into the existing strategies that exist at the OU, such as the strategic priorities and processes. And it's important, as we know, not to view this kind of work as an optional add-on, and so integrating it into the system that already exists would help to navigate against this. So, for example, with the inclusive curriculum, based on the time period when I conducted my research, there should be kind of this allowance of the inclusive curriculum tool to be embedded into the already established process of curriculum production, to avoid it being considered as just being an add-on to in relation to decolonial work. So I've highlighted some of the ways that the OU can move forward towards racial equality. Although my research provides a limited insight through a small sample, considering the Open University is the largest higher education institution in the UK, I believe that it does provide a great insight into just how complex decolonisation is and its application to higher education specifically is. And there's no doubt that great work is occurring within the OU with good intention. However, clarity is required regarding institutional understandings and barriers in relation to how decolonisation is understood and who is permitted to take part in this work, which requires addressing. My research findings, I believe, show how embedded coloniality is into the institutions, systems and structures at Westernised universities. And I've just left a question there for us to think about. So it's not just whether the university can be decolonised, but also whether the OU is ready to address the structural conditions that currently limit what decolonisation can be. So thank you so much for listening today. And there's my email if anyone has any questions.
Thank you so very much for that, Shannon. We now have Darren to provide us with a response and some thoughts on Shannon's recommendations. Darren.
Well, thank you. For those who don't know me, I'm Darren Gray. I'm a senior manager in Access, Participation and Success. And I have been involved with the inclusive curriculum tool that we have at the Open University since its inception, I think close to 8 years ago now. And I was also fortunate enough to be on the interview panel when we appointed Shannon to her PhD study with funding that come through from the Access and Participation Plan, which is the university's commitment made to the Office for Students to tackle inequities for minoritised and marginalised students in terms of access, awarding, and progress into further study and higher skilled employment. So we were really fortunate to be able to do that, to support Shannon with this. And I've been looking forward to this point for so many years, Shannon, because I've really been wanting to see your end conclusion. And I was one of the people that you interviewed in the early days. I'm not going to provide a particularly academic related response, because that's not necessarily my specialism, and probably what you're going to get from me for the next few minutes is something which is based upon more of an emotional response to what you've presented to us. And it's wonderful now that we have evidence that should be sparks to create further flames at the university to make some change. Just starting off, I just wanted to address the fact that how ironic it still is that a white middle-aged straight cis man is so heavily involved with a lot of the equity work that we have at the university. And I have had many conversations with colleagues and students over the years in terms of trying to understand some of the structural issues that create a number of unseen hurdles and ditches that trip up our students, and particularly in terms of these colonial aspects and racism and so forth. And it also occurs to me that even a person with a really good heart and a really good soul that is thoroughly committed to better outcomes for all and for such social justice can still end up being complicit within a machine that is structured in such a way that it creates disadvantage for some and advantage for others. So yeah, it's great to be able to do this work, but just looking at the irony of the fact that I'm here and the work that I've been at the centre of, the inclusive curriculum tool and the work around it was part of those conversations that we had as part of your research. And my experiences with it as well rings true to a lot of what you were saying in terms of the bottom down approach that still seems to be prevalent in the university, where general directions and edicts are provided from on high, but they don't necessarily find their way through, or where their work that is done and then is replayed back up the system, you then find that it's less likely that some work's going to be delivered through. So recommendations have been made right across through the inclusive curriculum tool, and a lot of the experiences that you're stating, Shannon, that then don't end up doing anything because the machinery in the system is so large and the truck just keeps moving down the road. There's no time, resource, commitment, or there is limited time, resource and commitment to actually getting inside the engine of that truck and making adaptations so the engine works better. So it is a challenge, but I am pleased that the inclusive curriculum work is moving to a way that it's becoming more embedded, and your evidence that you're providing here will really help us with that. But all of that leads me to think about the words could have, should have, would have, didn't, and that change needs more than words. It actually needs actions. And that classic statement of well done is better than well said. So it's a case of how we take this and turn it all into action. And again, the OU, like most universities, needs evidence upon evidence upon evidence to make small changes. So your contribution in this space will help with making some of those arguments, winning the hearts and minds going forward. I've made some other notes, but they're all over the place. So my apologies, because I was just so swept up with what you were saying, and so partly frustrated, but also really hopeful as well. You know, we're living in a world where polarization is really stark, and be interesting as well. I don't know whether you're going to have the chance to come back as well, Shannon, but the pendulum that seemed to be swinging in one direction post George Floyd and those horrors that were accepted and recognised and action was being put in place, seems in the last few years to be swinging in the other direction again, as there's been a pushback. So I'm really keen and really interested again in your recommendations about how we not necessarily sell, but how we bring everybody with us into enhancing our experiences, because quite a lot of EDI work over the last few years has sometimes felt like it's policing, or certainly it's been portrayed as policing or erasure, when actually that's not its intention. It's about enriching and opening up and looking for more opportunities. And I was really taken when you were discussing or describing how some staff and students fall into a certain camp. Is about what we taught, and can we be taught something which is a bit broader, and that will solve all the issues. And then others, particularly with lived experiences, actually saying it doesn't matter what we taught necessarily. I mean, it does matter, but it needs to be underpinned by systems and structures and creating. I was really struck where the student described it as a hostile, dangerous place. And how do we move beyond that to creating comfort for all of us, everybody involved with the OU, students, staff, visitors, that they feel that that it goes beyond just fitting you into a certain shape, and how can we be ourselves. And we first need to recognise who we are and our systems and our structures around that. I will just wrap up in a moment, but I was also intrigued when you were talking about a recognition for those that provide endeavours to bring about decolonisation or anti-racist activities, and how it's very often an additional, unrecognised, unpaid for burden placed upon certain people, and how we share that burden so it's taken by more people, but actually it stops feeling like a burden, and it becomes more of a collaborative opportunity for everybody to move forward. But I completely recognise what you're saying, that there are small numbers of people who carry a lot of this work, and particularly where you were mentioning about trauma and re-traumatising, to get forward and to actually make a difference. It sometimes has been the case that people need to expose parts of their life, parts of their experience that makes them feel very uncomfortable, or indeed re-traumatises them from their past. And the last thing I'll say about coloniality, from my perspective as a middle-aged, straight, cis white man, is that I've come to realise, and your work has helped with that, come to realise that things from the past aren't still just the past. They're not echoes that form our world. They still provide systems, structures, health inequalities, wealth distribution that shape the world that we're in now. And I don't have to feel guilty as a white man about what's gone on in the past. I should learn about it. I would feel guilty if I don't do anything about it going forward. So I'll leave it at that, but thank you and well done. This is brilliant work. Thank you.